All right, guys and everybody. I think we've a bit of a commute to get our coffee and food, so we'll lose a bit of time, I think, along the way. But we'll try and stay as close to our timings as humanly possible. I'll hand you over to Professor David Edgerton.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm David Edgerton from the Department of History here, and also one of the co-directors of the Sir Michael Howard Centre. So welcome back, everybody. We've got a treat in store now. We have three wonderful speakers who are going to provoke us into a general debate about the place of war in history. I'd just like to introduce them very, very briefly, but do look at their web pages for more details. First, we have Dr. Erica Charters from the Wellcome Institute at the University of Oxford, who's also now the director of the Centre for Global History, has written on medicine and many other things in the 7 Years' War. Then we have Selena Daly, immediately to my left, from University College Dublin, who's a great expert on futurism and the Great War. And in the middle, we have Professor Alexander Watson from Goldsmiths, who won the Wolfson Prize for History for a book on Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Great War. Now, our theme is war in history. Each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, and will then open up the floor to comments, questions, observations, and we'll aim to finish at 12:15 by this clock over here, which is running a little bit fast. So, without further ado, Erica, would you like to kick off?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you also to the organizers for the invitation. So what I'd like to offer here are just really some thoughts on scholarship on war in the early modern period, and very specifically on the 18th century, as well as some thoughts on the implications of the nature of this scholarship, not only for the history of war, but also for more recent developments in the discipline of history. So I was thinking here particularly about the shifts to global history. And this comes out of my research in these areas, but also out of my experience teaching the history of war to undergraduates and to postgraduates for the past few years, as well as trying to think about how to shape the nature of the discipline so that it faces outwards. And this comes from my experience directing or trying to direct a research center, so thinking about how we present the history of war and conflict to non-historians as well as to non-academics. So when I first started studying the history of war as a postgraduate student, I found that there was a really strong foundation of the field, especially thinking about the field as war and society. And building on the invigorating approaches from social history, I would say that from the 1960s and the 1970s, the so-called new military history really fundamentally, successfully broadened analysis to include studies of war's consequences on soldiers, on non-combatants, and on communities in general. And I can think of a range of representative texts, but I think it's also demonstrated, let me see if I can change slides here, really demonstrated in things such as the influential book series edited by Geoffrey Best, looking at the history of European war and society. For American historiography, Fred Anderson's work that analyzed the worldview, the religion, the socioeconomic backgrounds of soldiers in the 18th centuries in a people's army was very seminal in kind of influencing a broad range of historians to be thinking about the records left by soldiers. I also remember the revelation of reading John Shai's tremendous book, Toward Lexington, which examined the role of soldiers during peacetime as being transformative for British colonial politics as well as for American colonial society. Amazing to think that this was first published in 1965 and is now available as an ebook. Naval history, I think especially 18th century British naval history, underwent a very similar transformation during this period, so with administrative, economic, and social histories of the Navy firmly placing naval warfare and its institutions, things such as the dockyards, within broader histories of early modern society. And of course, the historiographical momentum that came from the concept of the military revolution, which squarely placed early modern European warfare and early modern European armies within the history of European state formation. I think all of this meant that the study of 17th and 18th century wars was fully integrated within broader historical scholarship. At the same time, I would say with cultural history dominating from the 1990s, there was also a sense of a rift between what could be called the traditional military historians and those examining, say, the culture of war. I remember we used to joke about going to military history conferences that had a traditional structure where most of the day had the kind of what I would call the meat and potatoes papers, not just looking at operational history, but socio and economic histories of war. And then at 5 p.m. there would be a session on things such as music and painting associated with war. And so it was set up as if those were a kind of enjoyable dessert, which you had after the main course, and that often didn't speak to the papers that went before, and vice versa. So as much as there was an admirable integration of armies and navies and of war itself into the social and political histories of early modern Europe, and as much as I think also the history of war has really benefited from the cultural approaches to thinking about the history of violence, fighting, to the practice of being a soldier and sailor, I would also identify a broader tension between broader cultural histories of 18th century Europe and histories of its war. And most particularly, I see this in the problem that war poses for histories of the Enlightenment. So as I've argued in my own scholarship, the notion of the Enlightenment suggests a cosmopolitan Europe that transcended national identities and transcended national boundaries and encouraged its participants to style themselves as citizens of the world. At the same time, Enlightenment writers considered the controlling and rationalizing of warfare as central to their broader project of progress and civilization. So the 18th century legal theorist Émile de Bataille, for example, was particularly pleased with the, as he said, the humanity with which most nations in Europe carry on wars at present. And so war, and especially the violence of war, was therefore often considered as evidence of the failure of the rational, progressive, and cosmopolitan program of the Enlightenment. And so as a result, the historical scholarship on 18th century European war has developed a tendency to emphasize the restraint of war during this period. So highlighting, for example, the development of laws of war, the notion of limited war, and producing an image of European warfare as something that was conducted rationally and diplomatically and coordinated at the highest level between polite enemy officers who would then go and dine together after battle. And I would add that what this means is very often when you read histories of Enlightenment periods, there's almost no mention of war, or you can then go and read another history that just talks about wars during the 18th century. So I would argue this is a problematic image, both in terms of historical accuracy, but also in terms of historical implications. This notion of restrained European warfare works to establish a contrast in terms of both geography and chronology. And so what I mean here is that warfare beyond Europe, so say indigenous wars involving scalping and attacks on civilians in the Americas, or colonial campaigns that were conducted overseas, these non-European locations become the site of what's described as violent and unrestrained war, which serves as a natural contrast to European restrained war. By the same token, the wars at the end of the 18th century, so those of the French Revolution and those under Napoleon, are also posited as unrestrained and unlimited in various ways. And here we can think of the use of the moniker total war as applied to the Napoleonic period. So again, positioned in contrast to 18th century limited war. So this means that histories of the Enlightenment hardly ever mention war, or if they do, they see it as an interruption, an obstacle to Enlightenment goals. So as a kind of historical problem that needs to be solved. By contrast, as I've argued elsewhere, if instead we take elements of the Enlightenment program, so scientific knowledge, for example, we see that 18th century war actually encouraged its development. So instead of the image of an 18th century Europe practicing restrained warfare, or one in which war was simply a problem to be solved, it would be more historically accurate to think about how war shaped and was part of Enlightenment practices, even if it was explicitly left out of or criticized in Enlightenment writings and in Enlightenment discourse. So by taking Enlightenment writers such as Voltaire at their word, historians may have been misled both about the nature of European warfare, but also by Enlightenment attempts to distinguish and separate out war from society. And in this, I find the argument of Yuval Harari helpful and persuasive. So as Harari sets out in his book, The Ultimate Experience, early modern individuals such as Descartes felt no need to write about the experience of war, given that war was just another mundane, though often troublesome, activity. It's in the later 18th century, with the rise of personal narratives, of sentimentality, of popular print culture, and the view that war was an experience, the ultimate experience, and one that could transform you and take you outside of normal society, that we see both a cultural shift in attitudes towards war alongside cultural products such as memoirs and paintings that themselves testify to these shift in attitudes. So Harari and other historians are pointing to that what was changed was not war itself, but rather our views of war, what was considered normal, expected, and acceptable. As a result, historians need to be careful in how we use these memoirs and records, given that they may not be evidence of a change in the nature of war, but rather evidence of a change in the nature of attitudes towards war and in how it was experienced and recorded. This also means that violence during 18th century wars can be used as a critique, that is, as a way to undermine historical narratives. For example, a recent popular history of the American War of Independence, this is Holger Hook's Scars of Independence, the subtitle is America's Violent Birth. So this book highlights the violence, and in the author's words, the unrestrained nature of this war, which is used to challenge traditional narratives of the War of Independence, particularly its political aspects. Now, as most military historians would hardly be surprised by the violent nature of this war, what is worth considering is why the book has garnered so much attention, keeping in mind that the author is a leading scholar of British history. I would argue that its novelty is based on a general assumption of restrained Western warfare in the 18th century, particularly between fellow Europeans. The violence of what was, after all, a civil war can only be shocking if we assume 18th century intra-European war was indeed limited and restrained. And conceptually, the book's argument relies on the notion that political and philosophical arguments are at odds with warfare, so that the violence and messiness of war contradicts and undermines the lofty philosophical and Enlightenment ideals of founding America. As a result, what I would like to emphasize is how many of our views of 18th century war rely on modern assumptions that have crept into our categories of analysis. That is, views developing throughout the later 18th century, but also common in the 19th and 20th centuries, views that war is fundamentally unusual, transformative, and problematic. This has implications for historical scholarship more generally. Humanitarianism, for example, with its focus on restraining and civilizing wars, often borrows a 19th century view of war as distinct from society and normal life. This 19th century mindset understands humanitarianism as taking place outside of war and as devoid of national interests. This clashes with an earlier and longer history of humanitarianism in which rules of war and the ethics of war were necessarily bound up with warfare itself and were part of the negotiations and part of the way in which wars could be won or lost. At the same time, imperial frameworks of war, particularly the notions of restrained war, which positioned Europe as rational and civilized and as the model of modernity, are implicit in many of these historical texts. The idea that unlimited and violent war takes place beyond the bounds of civilized nation-states, and thus only outside of Europe, is an obvious hangover from Enlightenment ideas that were about European identity and imperialism, as well as about the philosophy of liberty. But these ideas can creep into modern-day humanitarianism and governance. They become a kind of remnant and a leftover of Enlightenment definitions of modern war. I would thus argue that a useful way forward is to think globally about histories of war. And that is not that we all need to go study non-Western ways of war, but that we should be attuned to what are European assumptions, definitions, and rhetoric in our analysis, particularly when they are lurking in the very categories that we use in our historical scholarship, such as what we define as being a war, what is a conflict, what is unrestrained and limited war, as well as what is a violent war. So we should thus think carefully about taking Enlightenment and modern views of war for granted as universal truths. For the usefulness of history is that it can provide an alternate reading of modern phenomena, which can challenge rather than reinforce our current worldview. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing. Selena.
Okay, good morning, everyone. What I would like to do in the, I think, 15 minutes that I have available to me, is in many ways to follow a similar thread to what Eric has just done, but in a different context, so looking at the First World War period in particular, but I hope that some of the observations that I have will be relevant also to other conflicts too. So I'd like to lay out the framework of my own current research projects and then make some reflections on the way in which the study of war, and then, as I said, particularly the study of the First World War, can be enriched by a dialogue with the study of the history of migration. And these are two areas which traditionally have progressed very much on parallel tracks and with very little communication between them. So that's really what I want to talk about. When I'm talking about the history of war, I'm not talking about traditional military history or operational history. I'm not indifferent or hostile to those areas, but I'm much more talking about war and the idea of history of conflict in a much broader sense and bringing in different kinds of traditions. So what I'd like to do is to make a case, first of all, for the need to place the study of the Great War and the study of migration into dialogue with each other. And then I want to look briefly at one specific case study which I think could benefit from this approach in the history of the First War, namely Italy, which is my particular field of interest. So what I'll do is look at the place, first of all, of the First World War within the history of migration, and then conversely the place of migration history within the history of the First World War, and go on from there. So in migration studies, the First World War is considered, as I'm sure many of us know, a major watershed moment, and marking the end point of those 19th century mass migrations, something pointed out by Leslie Mock in her seminal work on migration in Western Europe since 1650. This periodization of global migration, with 1914 coming as this end point, has meant that the Great War period in general is overlooked or treated in a rather cursory manner by historians of migration. So just as for some examples, in the Italian case, this work by Bevilacqua and Francina, or for an earlier work by Mark Wyman. There are very many in which this is the case. And for the same reason, many studies of migration conclude precisely in 1914. Again, these are just some examples. German migrants in the British Empire, 1670 to 1914. Italians in Buenos Aires, in New York, 1870 to 1914. The Great Transatlantic Migrations, 1870 to 1914. Now, I'm not criticizing these works for their choice of chronology. We all have to choose an end point. None of us can write about all parts of history. All I'm saying, or so it's what I would like to focus on, are the consequences this kind of periodization has had for our ability to look at migration in the context of the First World War. And while all of these examples are from English language traditions, the same tradition absolutely holds, and the same pattern holds for scholarship also in French, German, and Italian, and they're the main languages I've looked at for the moment. So similarly then, and conversely, the phenomenon of migration is almost entirely overlooked also by historians of the First World War. As the eminent historians of migration, Jan and Leo Lushassin, have pointed out, except in the case of countries that explicitly define themselves as countries of immigration, so obviously the United States, Canada, Australia, most national historiographies have not until quite recently seen the need to incorporate a consideration of the phenomenon of migration into their national narratives. I think for those of us who are First World War scholars, we know that historiography has long been dominated by national perspectives, even though the transnational turn is certainly pushing us towards broader research horizons to explore the continent's global dimensions. But to date, I would argue that despite its inherently transnational character, the phenomenon of migration has been afforded actually minimal attention by historians of the Great War in any language or scholarly tradition. And to give just an example, in Jay Winter's authoritative 3-volume history of the Great War, transnational history of the Great War, which sets out to be a global history, and I think is, migration is addressed in fewer than 2 pages. So I think it gives us a sense, I think, of where the study of migration fits within the study of the First World War. And I'm not of course, trying to suggest that there is no work that has been done on migration and the First World War. Obviously, that's not the case. There's been quite a lot of very good work done, particularly on ethnic groups and ethnic minority communities in various different nations during the First World War. But a lot of the research in this area continues to appear in maybe isolated case studies or individual articles, and we're really lacking any kind of a broader comprehensive view, I think, that could allow us to move beyond these case studies to a broader understanding. And another complicating factor, I would argue, in terms of the way that we think about migration in the history of the First World War is also the fact that very many important studies about immigrants and the Great War are happening also within, for example, the context of American history, for obvious reasons. And these are two really seminal studies, but both very firmly entrenched within American, US history, as opposed to the study of the First World War. So I think it's just a symptom of the way in which we are all siloed, I think, into different disciplines, be that operational history or cultural history or American history, and it becomes very difficult for us to move beyond and to really have these conversations. And I think migration and the First World War have very much been victims of this approach. So before just going on any further, I'd like to just say a few words about, I suppose, what exactly I mean when I talk about migration. So forgive the rather crude diagram. Just to give a sense, we have really two main types of migration: voluntary migration and involuntary migration. So voluntary migration is generally economic in character, could be seasonal, temporary, permanent, and yes, I think the ability to firmly divide between voluntary and involuntary is difficult. There are always coercive elements in any voluntary migration, but for the sake of today, we'll leave it at this. Involuntary migration is obviously coerced mobility. A classic example is the transportation of slaves, obviously, from the United States. And then kind of completing the circle is return migration, which is a particularly important phenomenon, I would argue, during the First World War. So when I talk about the need to study migration, it's not just studying migrant communities, but it's also studying the relations between these immigrant communities and also their relations with their communities in their country of origin. Because remember, these are family groups that are divided, and sometimes even in three different places, immigrants in North and South America and in a home country, for example. So again, we have to look not just at country of origin and country of destination, but really look at this in a much more holistic way, I would argue, and flows of migration in both directions, so therefore also incorporating return migration. What I would argue really is that the study of the First World War, I think, has been largely receptive to the study of coerced mobility, and much slower to address the phenomenon of voluntary mobility or voluntary migration. So I'd just like to draw our attention to a few areas of coerced mobility that I think have been rather well addressed recently in the study of the First World War. So the first is refugees. For example, the Italian case of refugees after the Riot of Caporetto, the classic case of Belgian refugees, and also refugees in Russia during the First World War has been largely covered. We also have the mobility of prisoners of war. Heather Jones, up in the audience there, has written very important work on this, not here, but also Annette Becker's Oubliés de la Guerre is also worthy of note, I think, in this regard. So again, we can see that it's going beyond just an Anglophone tradition, I think. And lastly, colonial troops and the forced migration, forced mobility of colonial troops has also been receiving a lot of very welcome attention, very well-deserved attention, I would say. But what I would like to do in my current research, and what I'm trying to do in my current research, is to make the case for the establishment of the figure of the migrant, specifically, as a significant transnational actor during this period, in much the same way this scholarship has done for the refugee or the prisoner of war in the context of the Great War. So there are various reasons why I think that the foreground of the history of migration within the history of the First World War can be a beneficial perspective for us in those of us who are studying the history of war. First of all, I think it can contribute to a study of our understanding of global history, which actually has tended to overlook the Great War as a period of significance in understanding patterns of human exchange and interconnectedness. But then in tandem with this recent push towards transnational examinations of the conflict, there's been obviously an interest in exploring going beyond the Western Front. Very welcome also for an historian of Italy's war experience, that's a very welcome perspective. But going beyond just the European theatres and looking further afield. So, for one, South America has long been marginalised in histories of the Great War, and existing studies have been often diplomatic, economic in character, with very little in the way of a transnational perspective. Stefan Rinke's recent work is a welcome exception in this regard. And similarly, the work of GQ Zhu has brought, I think, very welcome attention to Asia's experience of the Great War, so again, very much moving us beyond this European this Eurocentrism in the approach. But I would argue that therefore migration, I think, is a way in which non-belligerent countries, for example Argentina, or countries located very far away from the fighting, such as those in Asia, could be integrated more satisfactorily into a global understanding of the conflict. And some work in this has already been carried out by Zhu himself, looking at Chinese workers in the Great War, this kind of voluntary migration of labour, in the Great War, but I would argue that it's not really a research direction that has been followed very much into something more comprehensive on a more global scale. So in the last few minutes that I hope I have at my disposal, I'd just like to focus briefly on the case of Italy and the way in which I think Italy's Great War experience and Great War historiography could really be enriched by this particular focus on migration. So it might seem paradoxical that Italy, which is maybe one of the countries certainly most associated with this mass emigration of the 19th century, it's certainly one of the best studied immigrant communities. It might seem paradoxical, therefore, that we might need this intervention in the case of Italy in the study of the Great War and migration. Just to give a little bit of context, in 1911, 1/6 of Italy's population was living outside its borders, totally about 5 million people, and there was, again, return migration was a particularly important phenomenon in the Italian case. And then the outbreak of war, for obvious reasons, disrupted very much the patterns of migration. But in spite of the general turn, I would say, towards the transnational study of the Great War, the historiography of Italy's Great War experience has not, on the whole, been very receptive to these kinds of cross-border transnational studies. One notable exception is this work by La Banca Nuberegger, which came out in both in dual language, German edition and also an Italian edition, which was very welcome. But the vast majority of studies of Italy and the Great War, even the best ones, remain very national in their focus, with very little attention to Italy's interactions beyond the Italian peninsula. And indeed, claims to Italian exceptionalism are very frequent. And I think, in a way, it's also interesting to look at even the title of this book. The Italo-Austrian War is in itself a claim to Italian exceptionalism. Though La Banca himself has pointed out the need for a transnational approach to Italy's First World War experience, and really said that it can't be deferred any longer, and I would wholeheartedly agree with him. But despite these comments about the necessity to internationalise the historiography of Italy's Great War, and then this general push towards transnational studies in the field, the phenomenon of migration has actually not been identified as a lens through which to examine transnational activity during the period. And the experiences of immigrant communities are almost entirely absent from Italian First World War historiography. Existing work that has taken place in the context of migration studies, Devoto being one of the most important historians in this regard, or again in the context of Italian-American studies. Christopher Sturba's work is important in this regard. So another reason, and this is really, I suppose, by way of concluding, is a reason I believe that a focus on migration can be particularly beneficial for the Italian case, but not only, is due to Italy's problematic relationship with imperialism. So recently, I'm sure we're all aware that empire has been employed very usefully as a framework for expanding the temporal and spatial boundaries of the First World War towards Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. So these are just, we can really see a focus of research scholarship in recent years on this theme, and I think very, very welcomely so. But the empire model remains very unsatisfactory for the Italian case. Again, Italy's colonialism was rather unsuccessful in comparison to other European neighbours, and very much more myth than reality. Even by 1921, there were a mere 30,000 Italians living in the Italian colonies of Somalia, Libya, and Eritrea. So I think it's far more profitable, therefore, to look at Italy's unofficial empire, the millions of Italians that are living outside of Italy's borders in territories unconnected with Italy's colonial ambitions. To me, that's a much more profitable way of looking at this, these dynamics. And Italy obviously is not unique in having large emigrant communities scattered across the world on the eve of the Great War. In 1914, there were millions of Europeans, Germany, Ireland, Russia, Greece, and countless others living in other parts of Europe, in the Americas, both North and South, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and as well also we have to remember significant Asian immigrant communities living, for example, in the United States as well as in other destinations. So again, it really does encompass a much broader global canvas. And these experiences have yet to be fully mined and explored in any comprehensive way. And I really think doing so would give us a way to understand and better understand the patterns of cultural exchange and interconnectedness during the war, which has been a central concern of the discipline of First World War studies for such a long time. And I think, therefore, migrant communities, the study of migrant communities can be considered complementary and a valuable alternative framework, for example, to the framework of empire, with which to study mobility and transnational dynamics during the years of the First World War. And I'll leave it at that. And because I've shown you so many book covers, I might as well show you my own.
very much indeed. Alex, would you like to?
No, I'm deeply regretting not having the idea of showing you my book cover. That was a huge error. I want to begin by saying thank you very much for the invitation to the organisers, in part because this is a really exciting event, in part because it's pushed me a bit. I do a lot of military history, but I rarely think about what doing military history actually comprises of. The other reason that this has been interesting is I very much enjoyed Mike Finch's keynote lecture, and full disclosure, it's forced me to write some of my introduction on the hoof, since I was guilty of some of the narratives that he was showing us to be wrong. What worries me a bit is that it's 11:15, and we've been talking a lot about military historians, but I'm still actually not clear who these people are. And I think perhaps we need a discussion about what military history is. I've now been doing military history of one sort or another for nearly 15 years, and I haven't met very many people doing the types of operational history that were current in the general staffs in the 1920s and 1930s. In some ways today we are all social and cultural historians as well. What military historians have been very adept at doing in the last 30, 40 years is grabbing other subdisciplines' methodologies. Very difficult to talk about armies now, even in a straight operational histories, without including soldiers and diaries, without talking about morale, integrating psychology. Military history, of course, is very well suited to integrating social and psychological approaches to human behaviour and more broadly to war. We all talk about the societies that our soldiers or generals came from. And so I don't see quite where we're setting the boundaries, who these military historians are. We all kind of know, but I'm not sure exactly where those boundaries are. I think that's worthy of more discussion. Of course, we try and avoid, or at least many of us try and avoid, calling themselves military historians. I do call myself a military historian, but depending on the job application, I've also called myself a cultural historian, a social historian, a historian of Germany, and a historian of Central Europe, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in that. But we tend to retreat, therefore, to being historians of war. It's kind of comforting, isn't it? It's broad, you know, it's war. I mean, war, that's big, obviously. We do big things. We don't do narrow troop movements in military history. We do big war things. And outside Germany, as Hugh has pointed out, that's not going to offend anybody. However, it's also highly problematic because I think that it shuts military historians out of the greater narratives and arguments within our profession. In some ways, interconnectivity between our colleagues working on gender, working on social history, so it's very good. We're interested in those methodologies. They've been adopted. They've been applied. But speaking and coming up with wider arguments and having our own research in those wider narratives is very difficult. It's not surprising, I don't think, in that context, that when we talk about the long 19th century, we still stop in 1914. We skip the war. The Germans actually get around this on one part by dividing their military historians into two. On one hand, you have the hardcore operational historians who do Militärgeschichte, as Hugh had said. The more new historian types, new military history types among my colleagues in Germany insist on doing Friedensgeschichte, peace studies, which has the advantage of not making war the exceptional, it avoids the assumption that war is an exceptional state, a different state. It avoids maybe the polarization between war and peace if you have people working in peace studies, sub-departments doing military history. I think, though, then we get into other definitional problems, because there is a question of what is war, which I think we probably do need to talk about as well. When, in a legal terms, I think it's fairly straightforward. If we're talking about interstate war, then that's fairly straightforward too. But if we think about recent events in our own times, what's recently happened in Ukraine with Russian hybrid warfare, the boundaries between peace and war suddenly seem much more blurry. If we think about what happened on Saturday night in our own city in London, Again, the boundaries between peace and war seem somewhat more blurred. Certainly, violence isn't unique to war, and I think, therefore, calling ourselves war historians risks cutting ourselves out of the major narratives of the major argumentation. As well as giving you a confession that I had to rewrite some of my introduction in the light of Mike's talk, the other thing that I should say, and this isn't my fault, the organisers got this wrong, is that my title wasn't Not My War, The Strange Silence on 1914-18 in the Historiography, because that would suggest that no one else other than me has written about the First World War. Sometimes, which in my more arrogant moments, I like to think they've done it right anyway, but in practice isn't true. And the key words of East Central Europe were missing. So Not My War, The Strange Silence on 1914-18 in the Historiography of East Central Europe. Really, really important distinction there. And I wanted to... How long have I got? 5 minutes?
A bit longer.
A bit longer. And what I wanted to do, therefore, in the rest of the talk was illustrate what I mean about this. On one hand, military historians embracing other parts of the discipline's methodologies, but at the same time not being part of the wider narrative and arguments. And the case of East Central Europe is a really, really good example in the 20th century over that. The First World War in East Central Europe was, if it was anywhere, it really was the seminal catastrophe, as Keenan famously called the First World War. For much of the period 1914 to 18, East Central Europe, so the lands of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, what today is Western Russia as well, but certainly Poland, Ukraine, Belarus were battlefields. All these areas were also recruiting grounds. They were recruiting grounds for imperial armies, the German army in the west, the Austro-Hungarian army further to the south, and then the Russians to the east. And East Central Europe, this geographical area, was also a region of competing imperialist projects and competing national designs and nationalist designs too. And the war changed in many ways everything. It swept these empires away. It replaced the geopolitics with a set of so-called nation-states, states which at least purported to belong to and be nationally homogenous, although in practice they weren't. In terms of the experience of war, there were few areas that had more intense experiences. We talked about migration. I'm afraid I'm going to talk about forced migration, because that's what most First World War historians are more comfortable with, and also because it was very, very significant in this area. The Russian Empire displaces 3.3 million people in 1915. The Russian Empire also conducts the East Central Europe's first programme of ethnic cleansing in East Central Europe in the first years of the war. An anti-Semitic programme designed to clear Jews away from certain areas to turn Ukrainians into Russians. The diplomacy of the war and the attempts to gain military advantage by one side or another by winning favour with the subject minorities in these areas, this fuelled nationalism in the region. Other powers beyond the Russians undertake smaller massacres. The Austro-Hungarians undertake small massacres of Ukrainian speakers in 1914 and again in 1918. Germany's Lebensraum ideas, ideas of living space, develop in this war. So a very influential area for the rest of the century. Broadly, one can separate the historiography into three areas. In terms of the older historiography, that is the pre-2000 historiography, the First World War in East Central Europe barely was paid much attention at all. That was in part because Soviet historiography started in 1917. It was the Russian Revolution, particularly the Bolshevik Revolution, which for Soviet historians kicked off the 20th century. At the end of the Soviet period in the 1990s, for historians of Poland and other East Central European nationalities, 1918, not 1914, was the start date because, of course, this is the independence date. So 14 to 18, it was skipped there too. Military historians, though, also shouldered much of the blame. Much of the military history in this region was operational history in the narrowest sense, very traditional operational history. That was partly due to archival restrictions. It was also, though, due to narrow interests. And in this day and age, having had quite a lot of research over the last 15 years on this area, John Keegan's claim in 1999 that World War I imposed on the civilian population almost none of the deliberate disruption and atrocity that was to be a feature of the second seems to be something remarkable. It's impossible to argue that now, and it seems very, very naive. But of course, he was writing without the research background that we now all have. Despite that research background, though, 1418 is not well connected and integrated into the wider narratives of this crucial region. And it's not well integrated into the narratives of the period before the First World War, and also it's not well integrated in the period after. And in my last 3 minutes or so, I'm briefly going to cover that. Habsburg historiography. So Austria-Hungary, an empire of 50 million people, 11 formal languages and many other informal ones as well, covering right across Central, Eastern and Southern Europe, has currently 2 narratives when one is thinking about the later empire. Habsburg specialists, that is, specialists of the Habsburg Empire who tend in their own research to go up to 1914 and not beyond that, present the empire now as a healthy empire, managing nationalism successfully, and brought down almost coincidentally by a world conflict which broke out in 1914. By contrast, military historians don't read any of this new Habsburg stuff and talk about a failing empire whose degeneration was long-term, it was undermined by nationalism, and its frailty and obsolescence was exposed by its attempt to participate in a modern total war. And never shall the 2 narratives meet. There doesn't seem to be much dialogue going on between these 2 sets of historians. And it's a shame because there's naiveties and problems, huge problems with both narratives. From the Habsburg specialist side, only going up into 1914 and presenting the war as almost a natural disaster ignores the fact, of course, that Austria-Hungary bore more responsibility than any other power for this war. And thinking about how and why Austria-Hungary caused that war and the peacetime preconditions to that would, I think, modify some of this narrative of a healthy empire that's very popular in historiography at the moment. On the other hand, the military historians do need to take some of this nationalism, some of these arguments about nationalism and deep research into the peacetime empire into consideration too. And it strikes me that there's a huge opportunity being lost here, in part both of our understanding of the war itself and why the war breaks out, but more broadly, I think one of the ways in which military historians could appeal to historians of the pre-1914 empire is by pointing out that war produces huge amounts of documentation, that on loyalty, on identity, both quantitative and qualitative, which informs and would engage with some of these debates going on in the literature on pre-1914 East Central Europe. The other major disconnect between the 1418 war in East Central Europe is with Holocaust historiography. For a long time, Holocaust historiography focused on Germany. Recently, the trend has actually been to place East Central Europe in the centre of this, with Tim Snyder's book Bloodlands. And Snyder talks about interacting imperialist totalitarian projects with Hitler and the Nazis attempting to realise one racial utopia, while on the other hand, Stalin and the Soviet Union attempting to realise his socialist utopia, all in the same area between Berlin and Moscow. Snyder starts in 1928 with Stalin's rise to power, the beginning of collectivization, and the beginning of the Ukrainian hunger famine, and goes through to 1945. But he himself admits that actually the First World War should be key to this. He begins his book, the first sentence is, the origins of the Nazi and the Soviet regimes and of their encounter in the Bloodlands lie in the First World War of 1914 to 18. and that's all the information we get. Which is really, really, really frustrating, or possibly an opportunity, depending on one's perspective. In some, I think that there's scope for thinking about ideas, ideology, and personnel, how these come out of the First World War and inform both German and Soviet planning and practices just 20 years later. I think that the race hatreds in the region, if we move beyond the political and think about the local collaborators, the Poles that Jan Gross talks about in his book Neighbours, or Ukrainian and Lithuanian collaborators have also been under discussion. Thinking about the race hatreds that came out of the First World War in this area should also inform that debate. Huge debate too about Jewish resistance and lack of it. And often Jews are presented, even in East Central Europe, as coming out of this rather peaceful society without any recognition that just 20 years before, in much of this area, in fact all of this area, there had been huge deportation projects, there had been projects of ethnic cleansing and ethnic reorganisation. And it strikes me that the failure to integrate what military historians broadly defined have researched and written about into these wider narratives ultimately harms our understanding of key events in the 20th century as a whole. It undermines our understanding of the 20th century as a whole. I'm out of time, so 15-second conclusion, which is simply that to raise questions of how do we approach this as military historians? How do we approach this as military historians? Possibly we need to define better who we are. Possibly we need to avoid that question at all costs. And I think we need to think about interconnectivity as well, engaging in debates beyond military history and new military history debates with each other, and thinking about these wider historiographies of which we should be a part of. That's a very preachy note to end, but thank you very much for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to our three speakers. Now, while you're all thinking of comments and observations, perhaps I'll make one. To connect back to Michael's talk earlier, perhaps the point is that military history and history of war have done spectacularly well, and we've had plenty of evidence from this panel today of the richness of work that's been done. And the second point is one of comparison with other historical fields. I think there probably isn't a historical field that could not claim to be underrepresented in historical studies. I mean, business historians, economic historians, historians of railways, historians of the sea would all, with equal justification, I think, say much the same thing. And perhaps the problem is that we just expect academic history to cover everything. We should start from the assumption that it doesn't. It covers tiny fractions of human experience over time, and in that context, perhaps historians of war and military historians are actually rather than underrepresented. So, on that positive note, let's open it up. We'll take observations one by one or in groups as the conversation develops. To the back, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a freelance journalist and broadcaster. That's perhaps the latter one is a rather grand title, not the reality. And I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet Union, Customs and Excise. I would just say in relation to the points about the merger or differences between operational and conceptual military history, that the biggest failing I saw in Western European and to perhaps a little lesser extent United States law enforcement, and I would use that in a very wide term, engagement with the new EU member states, and particularly the ex-Soviet states, where I've worked a lot since I left the service, was, frankly, a failure to understand that these are militarized societies. And indeed, in a considerable number of cases, not to take account of how relevant operational military history is to activities today. I mean, that's particularly the case in the Baltic states, where smuggling patterns, which are intimately linked with power structures across the border in Russia, really parallel what happened in 1944. There really is an issue there. My question is there any scope for expanding the cooperation that was referred to in the previous sessions of military staff colleges and courses with a wider involvement of both specific and wider military history academic groups with the wider civil service and indeed big business, because I think some big business would be quite cooperative, because the police in particular, but generally the civil services as a whole, I think would benefit enormously, because so many of the areas of the world they have to deal with now, and not just outside Europe, are not classical socio-economic liberal democratic states. They need a bit of realism from yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's park that question. I'm sure people in the audience might want to address that issue, perhaps later in the day. But let's go to the question from Heather.
Thank you very much for 3 fantastic papers. And I've been thinking a little bit about what links them, particularly Alex's paper and Selena's. Obviously, part of the global turn in history has also been the spatial turn, and they're looking at spaces. And I think perhaps one of the gaps that I was thinking about from your papers in relation to Jonathan Fennell's question about the future of history and military history is this question of a history of war that relates to the history of borders, and how military history relates to telling the history of borders and fighting on borders, and how cultural and social historians of war deal with that question too. And here there's a really interesting synergy between the Bloodlands thesis, the borders, the borderland areas of Central and Eastern Europe that Alex was talking about, and Selena's thesis about migration and war migration as a specific kind of threat. And if you look at the historiography being written by Francesca Piana on war humanitarianism in World War I, which shows refugees as threats, or Philippa Hetherington on the pre-war period and women migrants as threats to the established order, I think there could be something really fruitful as a synergy, maybe modelling on the Mapping War project being done in Dublin. So there's some really interesting ideas about how do military historians engage with this idea of borders. Borders as a particular fighting space where fighting happens in particular ways, and borders being reconceptualised by societies as part of that.
Great. All the papers were about borders. Does anyone want to come in on this very interesting theme? If not, I'll ask the panel to respond quickly on borders. Quick responses on borders, since you're all in one way or another dealing with them.
I mean, I completely agree, Heather. In fact, when I first started to look at the First World War, I actually came through a study of the border region of Trentino and Alto Adige in the border between Austria-Hungary and Italy at the time, and that actually brought me into a study of the First World War. So I completely agree that I think in many ways you could. I'm talking about doing a study of migration and the First World War as a broad concept. Equally, I think you're right, it could be a study of borders and the First World War. I think we could get really very fruitful dialogue, I think, coming out of that. Just in terms of the idea of refugees as threats, I think that's really interesting, and something I've come across again in some of the research that I've been doing, where in fact part of the motivation for Italy's intervention into the war was the fact that there were hundreds of thousands, 500,000 Italian immigrants from France returning to Italy at the beginning of the war, and they were all unemployed. So what were we going to do with these men if Italy entered the war? They could all be employed in the army. So this idea that there was social unrest because of these returning refugees or returning migrants. So I think again that idea of refugee as threat is very interesting, and again I'm sure there are a lot of parallels in other national contexts too, and it would be interesting. Certainly I'd like to look a little bit more at that too.
Anything? No. Let's go to the back. Oh, sorry, you did. Go.
Which is just that, borders are big kind of at the moment, both in historiography and in politics. I just want to say 2 things, which is yes, clearly, as recent historiography has shown, as Robert Gevart's work is showing, for example, the issue of borders and lack of borders is fundamental, especially to First World War historiography, which I think changes the way in which borders are drawn in a more fundamental way than had been done for centuries, insofar as rather than having state borders or borders defined on dynastic grounds, suddenly ethnic borders come in. So that, yes, borders are going to be key to anything we do. The other thing that I want to say is that I don't think historians can do this, military historians can do this themselves, and this is an example of the connectivity I think that I was talking about that we need, because borders sure are in part a military issue, but actually the issue of borders, whether you can control borders, whether you can defend borders, these go back into state ideologies, ideas of course state sovereignty, very current in our own times, and then broader issues like you're talking about, like migration and so forth. So this is something in which we need to reach out with.
Yeah. Just to add one thing, actually something I meant to say in my talk and I forgot, I think also our study of migration and by extension to do with borders also brings us on to a study of the nature of citizenship, which I think changes fundamentally in the First World War. And I think we can't think about migration coerced or voluntary and borders without actually then thinking about how the citizen as a figure changes. I think that's again another fundamental element to this whole debate, but they're all kind of interconnected issues. Sorry.
Great, thank you. There's questions at the back, yeah.
Yes, thank you. John Peaty. One of the hats I wear is International Secretary of the British Commission for Military History, which is the British wing of the International Commission for Military History. And my question is prompted both by the excellent keynote and the excellent papers we've just heard, and that is language and linguistic skills. How many British military historians or historians of war know French, German, Italian? I would suggest the three panellists probably know their Italian, their German and their French. But it is a question, I think, that is fundamental to the new military history, the new history of war. And as a nation, this is a cliche. I don't think we do languages and linguistic skills well.
Yes. Yes.
It's wonderful to hear such a perspective. I, in fact, my background is not in history, my background is in Italian studies. I now am an historian, but I teach in a school of languages, I don't teach in a school of history. And to me, it is impossible to do history without having a deep understanding of language. And I don't think it's just about a study of being able to read something, but it's also an understanding, I think, of the culture of that country, because again, if you're reading a document and there are references, you need to understand where that person is coming from. I think we can only do that with a joint study of culture, literature, and history. And certainly, I think the decline in language skills in the United Kingdom is very problematic, very troubling, particularly in the current climate. But I agree that I think historians, I think the more they can engage with linguistic skills, I think the better and the richer the discipline would be. But thank you very much. I really agree with what you're saying. Great.
Let's go to the question over here. Oh, there. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Alex Mayhew from the LSE. I'm studying for a history PhD in an international history department in a social sciences university, and it strikes me as one of the biggest problems that face us as military historians and historians more generally is actually the discipline as a whole, the historical discipline as a whole. So we were told from the beginning of our PhD that we should seek not to publish our work in edited volumes because it means less for the ref. And yet Selena's historiographical overview, many of your best examples were edited volumes. So actually, is it a problem with the structures that surround us? Because it's not the same in France, and they have some really great edited volumes. And some of our best history isn't being published there. And also, should we broaden our perspective, as social scientists do, and engage with people from outside the historical discipline? So Sunken Neitzel's Soldaten is a really good example of how utilising specialist knowledge outside of history can produce really excellent work.
Anyone would disagree with any of that?
Yeah, I think you should be publishing in peer-reviewed journals. I think that I think that the standard in peer-reviewed journals is generally much higher. There are exceptional edited volumes. I'm not saying they're not, but if you've been immersed in German historiography, you're going to be very, very, very sceptical of any Sammlungsschrift or edited volume because yeah, I wouldn't go down that particular academic cultural route. That would be more. In terms of the engagement with other disciplines, yeah, go for it. I mean, this is utterly key, and I think actually both conferences and peer-reviewed journals, in part because of the pressure of funding bodies, and in part simply because it's produced so much interesting research in recent years, are very, very open to exactly that. So you have my blessing. Not that it counts much.
I think there is an issue here, and I speak as somebody who does not have the ref hanging over me, gladly so.
Or Brexit.
Or Brexit, indeed. Well,
Well,
that's
you
another
do.
conversation. Well, Northern Ireland is another issue. But anyway, but I would just say that I think that there is a case of the tail wagging the dog. While I agree that as a young academic, privileging publishing in peer-reviewed academic journals is probably the way to go to get a job. However, I absolutely agree. I mean, there are excellent edited volumes, and published with leading academic publishers who really can bring together a debate in a way that is not possible in a special issue. So I do think there is an issue with the institutional structure of the ref that then determine what scholarship we do. But that's, again, a broader issue.
Yeah.
So I would agree with what you're saying.
Okay with that.
I'm Tarek Barkawi, also at the LSE. I have no idea what discipline I'm in. My advice is publish one version in the edited volume, another version in the journal.
Very wise.
That'll solve that problem. I've got, thank you for the panel for some really wonderful papers. It's sort of two kind of big general questions. If you look back over the kind of reviews of military history that the keynote was citing, one of the divisions that are used to cut up different kinds of military history and war history is your closeness to operations, conduct of war, or combat. To what extent do we still think that's the case? That those who deal with the conduct of war are different and separate from those who deal with society, culture, economy, and the rest of it, and what might be some of the advantages of integrating that? That's one question. Second question, if military history now is so rich and does social, cultural, gender, all kinds of other things, and is fully up to date with what's going on in the history discipline, isn't the problem in the rest of the social sciences and history and their attitude towards war? None of us are confused about the significance of war in human history. But if we take seriously what Erica was saying about how the Enlightenment has written war out of the architecture of our lives, out of the architecture of the main social science disciplines, we need to write it back in. And we need to think about how it is that we do that with them, not about what it is going on in our practice in navel gazing.
Thank you very much. Does anyone want to comment further along those lines before I throw it open? Yes, please. Let's, we have the mic over here.
It's actually to add fuel to the fire rather than to... But the other thing I think we need to think about in this is, which follows in part from what Erica was saying, I mean, she is a chronological issue. In the 20 years of editing war in history, what always struck me very forcefully, what struck us all involved with the editing of that, was we really struggled to get articles that weren't in the 19th or 20th centuries. We were determined to spread the chronological range as far as we could, and the 18th century was a breakpoint. And your points obviously brought out one of the reasons why that was the case, that 18th century historians who want to be properly paid up 18th century historians write 18th century history, they don't write military history. It's even worse for medievalists, I mean, or for ancient historians actually have changed a bit. They do write more about the history of war. But medieval history certainly has this problem. If you're a properly paid up medieval historian, you will write to for other medieval historians, not for military historians. So what we're not getting is good longitudinal studies, actually. That's a consequence. And there is a further point that I think relates to the ref, and I think there can be too much navel-gazing about the ref, because in many respects, of course, it has forced people to be active and productive, and that's been good over the long run. When I think of some of my colleagues in the early years of my careers, you needed a good kick up the arse, and this is given them. But I would say that the other consequence has been an over-specialization, which has also worked against longitudinal studies. And that in particular, we talk, and particularly if we're studying war, we talk about interdisciplinary approaches. And Tarek, understandably says, I don't know what I am, because in many ways Tarek does all that. Absolutely, and I think many of us do it in all sorts of different ways. But actually, the ref disciplines don't allow for that. And the consequence of that has been that if you want to do a big overarching study, you will struggle to justify it in ref term. And a further consequence of that is that you will also speak increasingly to a smaller audience. We have this paradox of military history having great popularity, but if as an academic you want to write a big subject in a broad area, then actually that may not be referable.
Could I just throw in a comment on this point, and to pick up the point about the problem being with the historians and the social scientists who ignore war, and pick up the point about the Enlightenment and maybe broaden it to liberalism more generally. I mean, clearly there is a very powerful academic intellectual narrative which excludes war in all sorts of ways. Yet war is very present in most history, certainly the 19th and 20th century. But maybe what's missing is not so much war. Maybe this may be a problem with the history of war, to pick up the point you're making. There's not so much war that's missing as the military. And perhaps we should consider the military in peacetime. It speaks to a point that was made earlier as well, as part of the remit of the history of war, and perhaps it is what is specifically military that's missing, or specifically connected with the armed forces is missing, rather than the history of war more generally. So there's really lots of issues there. Eric, would you like to kick off?
Right, where to start? I mean, I suppose just one observation I have is I do think that there's a kind of hierarchy. I would say that there's still this notion of the closeness to war, and I'd say probably not just the closeness to combat, but maybe the closeness to campaigns, especially in the period I look at where battle doesn't take place that frequently, but people being on campaign takes quite a long time. I was thinking about how I was once introduced by a military historian to other military historians who shall all remain unnamed as saying, it's okay, she's one of us because she understands operational history. And so I do think it is true that in some ways there's a fear that someone might call themselves a historian of war, but actually might not take the operational part seriously. And I wonder if there is, in terms of thinking about how we define ourselves, there is a sense in which maybe there is this core sense of what we might respect as having space within the kind of scholarship that we do, even if it doesn't necessarily have to define what we do. I also think in terms of kind of writing at war, my other sense is that a lot of this comes back to, and maybe this global approach comes back to the sense that we're also writing in nation states, in the sense that if we think about how one of the problems that we seem to be coming across is how military historians also tend to be defined according to their national perspective, which again is problematic because I think it sets up war as something which ties into questions about national identity or national perspectives as well. So I think there might be a double conceptual issue going on, and therefore this assumption that somehow national perspectives are natural, which I think again is part of what we're encountering, both in terms of what we define as being war, but also whether or not nation states themselves are kind of the model that we now see the world turning into, in which now I think we're looking at a kind of disintegration of those assumptions.
I think, I just wonder in the following way. Firstly, yes, I think operations, conduct of war and combat are central to most, if not all, military history. But I think it's actually a huge misnomer to take them as separate. In a couple of very basic examples, 1914, advancing armies are impeded by floods of refugees, and often this is forgotten. Far too much military history is written as if it's these armies are operating under tabula rasa, which I always find amazing. My own current project is the history of a siege in 1914-15, in which the engagement between the civilian population and the military was absolutely fundamental, while around the besieged city there's a program of ethnic cleansing going on. So certainly operations, conduct of war and combat are fundamental, I think, to what we do, but taking them as separate from everything else is a massive, massive, massive mistake, and it's too often made by us as military historians. That then leads me on to your cry of despair about, isn't it everybody else's fault that they're not listening to us? And I don't buy that. I mean, I'm sure there's some truth in it, but I think that there's far more that we could be doing, as I think the example of Habsburg historiography that I gave you, and indeed engaging with Holocaust historiography in a much greater sense. I think there's far more that we could be doing to talk to our colleagues and to get them to sit up. And the fact that military history actually does sell, that it does get reviews in newspapers, that there is widespread interest, I think can be exploited to allow us to do that. I'm not saying that it's easy, but I think the potential is there. And in terms of Hugh's point about over-specialisation, I think I agree that's a massive problem. On one hand, we're being pushed in one direction. I think the ref
does have something to do with it, does have a lot to do with it, but I think actually it comes from within as well. I mean, I don't think, I'm not suggesting that you were, but the ref is only part of a wider story in terms of what universities are doing to us. And there I am willing to have a cry of despair. But again, there are big volumes written. Possibly the role is for publishers to help buy us out of teaching. There you go. That's one that we can come back to later. Yeah, this is a difficult circle to squared circle, circle square. You know what I'm saying? It's the demand on one hand for more specialisation, while on the other hand to speak widely, is difficult, but people do it. Relying on secondary literature for a part of it, and then integrating it into broader, you know, it's done. You've done it.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in response to what Hugh was saying there, and following on from what Alex was saying. I mean, I agree that the ref is not all bad. I say still as an outsider to the whole process, but it's not all bad, and I can understand your point. What I would also say is that, apart from the ref pushing possibly towards over-specialisation, I also think there's a major issue with, on the one hand, different I suppose, messages that were being given, as particularly as, well, I'm not really early career anymore, but for early career people. On the one hand, interdisciplinarity is great, looking beyond disciplinary boundaries, but then what are the jobs? Lecture in British history, lecture in military history, lecture in French history. So I think actually it's not just the ref that's pushing that, but it's also institutions in terms of where they're hiring. I think that's a major problem for early career scholars, trying to get jobs, that they are forced into these silos, and therefore interdisciplinary history becomes inherently a gamble and dangerous. I think that's a broader issue also.
Jonathan,
I mean,
and then over here.
I feel like there's an interesting argument emerging. There's many interesting arguments emerging, but one that certainly caught me is we have a keynote that says military history is marginalised with caveats. And then we have some interesting papers that talk about parallel historiographies. So actually, are we doing the new military history? We talk the talk, but actually, are we walking the walk? And then another set of arguments is we're not thinking fully about the consequences of what we're studying. Now, if we actually did those things, your point, Alex, do we get rid of military history altogether? If we actually do the new military history, and we actually fully think about the consequences of our research, there's no need for military history. Let's just put the bullet in, put it to bed, game over. If we actually do what we're supposed to do, there's no need for military history.
Do you want to come in on this point? And then over there on the left.
Sorry, just you the last word. Sorry.
If I can follow up on that and a couple of other thoughts. I'm delighted that a younger generation thinks that operational and social, cultural, military history have now merged, because that's what we decided to do 20 years ago. And, okay, I won't reminisce on that. We'll save that for the other occasions. But two broader points from that. First of all, certainly about that period, and even now, there is some very bad cultural history involving warfare being written by people who have not grasped operational history. And I think we've got the definition yesterday the wrong way around. It's not whether or not we describe ourselves as military historians or not. All military historians are and should be broad-ranging in this. It's the historical question we're trying to approach. If, for example, and it's a big example, you're trying to understand the mechanics of the First World War, even in the very broad sense, as with empires and refugees, you need to understand at a quite detailed level the tactics and operational factors that caused the deadlock on the Western Front. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand what might be called and has been called the motor of the First World War. The same is true to a lesser extent of the strategic bombing offensive in World War II. And these are very specific operational and tactical military issues. But if you're not studying that kind of issue, you don't need operational military history. I think we need to regard it as one of the tools or one of the methodologies that we might use as military historians, rather than saying, are you an operational military historian or not? I'd like to suggest that approach.
Would you like to come in on this theme? Yes. Yes, excellent. Down here, please, Jonathan.
Jack Watling, Birkbeck. I come from a department where I think when the planets align just so, there's one person in the department that occasionally calls themselves a military historian. And I've had the pleasure of kind of inviting military historians in whenever I can to kind of speak to colleagues. And watching that interaction, something that I observe is that the cultural historians and economic historians and historians of imperial history and so forth have a very clear idea of what military historians can take from their research and how they can use it to improve their research. I'm not convinced that the same goes the other way. The military historians, if they're traditional military historians, tend to justify their work in terms of what we can learn from it in the context of contemporary issues, which of course leads to a great deal of skepticism among their colleagues, because that sounds awfully kind of like you're inserting present issues into the past. And the new military historians tend to justify what they're doing in terms of, look, what we're doing is legitimate because it's almost what you're doing. And that's sort of how it comes across. So I suppose my question is, if you were to summarize how you feel historians who don't specialize in conflict, economic historians, cultural historians, whatever it might be, what is it that they take from a military historian's research to improve and enrich their own study? I think that's the thing that we often fail to articulate clearly, and that we're much better at justifying ourselves to the public in that sense than to our colleagues in other disciplines.
Great. Let's get some answers or observations back on those themes.
Sorry if that sounds somewhat like a caricature. I'm just being bluntly provocative.
Are we all trying to abolish military history? Would success mean that it had no place?
I mean, I would very much agree with what you're saying, that I think that, I would define myself as a cultural historian, but I absolutely agree that it's very difficult for me to do the research that I'm trying to do right now without having a deeper understanding of operational history. It's one of the areas that I feel is probably a gap that I need to fill more systematically, despite my trepidation of the field, because it's out of my comfort zone. But I agree that I think it's very difficult to be a successful historian, be that an economic or social or cultural historian, of conflict, without understanding those dimensions. I think you're completely right, and therefore I think that's what we can get from military histories, and I think that it fills gaps that I think are there very present. So
I'd echo that too, and in terms of the other respondent, I suppose I'm very keen on definitions. I've probably spent too long on the continent, but I think definitions are important, and thinking about what history is more broadly is important. I've always understood history as the study of how human society changes over time, and that does unite us with historians of all different parts of the discipline. The interesting thing about especially modern military history is that modern wars change society remarkably quickly, which is what attracted me to the subject in the first place. And so I think that I mean, that argument could be made, but I think that a more important one than saying, look, we kind of do what you're doing, is actually to say, you actually don't understand because you need to look at this period of rapid change. And until you've done that, you need to incorporate that into your longer narrative or into your longer argumentation. And that's the beef that I've got with too much current historiography, both war historiography and, if you like, peace historiography. Because I think if you're interested in human change over time, then they both have to be incorporated. So I think we can be a little more aggressive, or confrontation isn't quite the right word, but I think we can be more forthcoming than saying simply, we're doing what you're doing. We can actually say, what we're doing shows that you don't understand.
Yeah, can I just quickly add, I suppose I was thinking about, no, I don't think we should abolish our specializations or our definitions in all sorts of ways, and I think obviously they're useful, but partly because I was thinking about how, building on Michael Finch's keynote, thinking about how we might measure success and successful integration, which might be less the disappearance of these categories, but I was thinking about how perhaps less looking at positions that are explicitly military history, but more thinking about, for example, if there is a chair in British history, would they also be identified as a military historian, is actually, I think, for most of us, being a more tangible indicator of the success of military history, rather than how many particular lectureships in military history there might be. Just thinking about how we justify ourselves to our colleagues, the other thought I had is that I'm constantly struck by my undergraduate teaching when I teach history of war courses or military history courses, that I have a huge intake of students who expect to be taught operational histories only, and we are really struggling at the moment in having anything more than 1 or 2 female students take our courses as a result, which I think is interesting given that in Oxford there's quite a few of us who are teaching military history and who are female. And so there seems to be also a striking gap between our undergraduates and what they expect military history to be and what many of us are researching and publishing, and I don't quite know yet why we haven't solved that gap, which actually seems more serious than the one with our colleagues.
Question? Yeah.
Sorry, David Murphy here from Maynooth University in Ireland. Just a question. I mean, we've been spent most of the morning actually debating the concept of defining ourselves and what we do. Are we getting slightly tied up with that as a profession? I mean, I'm just thinking of other circumstances that I've been in internationally, one in France and one in the Netherlands, where there were seminar groups that brought together military practitioners, academics in military history of all shades, operational, war and society, whatever, other interdisciplinary academics, journalists, justice officials, policemen, and on a regular basis they would talk about war, conflict, impact nationally, internationally, society. There was no definition of the issues. They were all just coming to it more or less as practitioners from different aspects. And he didn't seem to spend so much time defining the definitions and come up with these kind of like distinctions. I think, you know, is it a question that we spend too much time? We need to get out and be actually more evangelical about what we do and actually spend less time actually in these situations discussing amongst ourselves what we actually are. I don't know if that's a provocative question.
You also get to come in on that? Please, yeah.
I would just like to add to the gentleman's point about the fact that the social scientist is maybe not engaging and perhaps being somewhat hostile. Could I also suggest that there is a need to evangelize with international organizations and perhaps through them with the organizations they fund? Because I've always found that in organizations like the UN and offshoots the World Bank, and to a somewhat lesser extent the European Commission, as opposed to the EU member states, that frankly culturally down on this, they are rather hostile to anything smoking of militarism, and that of course they do fund a lot of work and a lot of NGOs, and so maybe a careful dialogue, because I think the gentleman's point is very, very well made. When I worked in Ukraine,
could we leave that? I think you made your point. We can pick it up from there. Question down here.
Take one last one. Is that all right, Jonathan?
Jonathan Buff from University of Birmingham. Can I just suggest that perhaps actually the distinction we need to draw is between historians of causation and historians of context? This is a follow-up on a point that David Reynolds, I think, has made, and that as many operational or many military historians perhaps tend to veer towards the causation side, which makes it very hard for them to talk to, for example, some cultural historians who are more interested in the context and the lived experience, for instance, rather than the causation. And so to do what Alex is suggesting and sort of say, look, you've got it wrong, it actually poses a kind of existential threat to them as historians, which might be alienating rather than inclusive.
Great. Would you respond on that point?
I'd probably better respond on that point, haven't I? 'Cause it's an entirely fair point. My point is that there has to be there's a symbiotic relationship between the two, and that in the same way that we can't do properly, or military historians can't properly study war without an understanding and engagement with not just the research, but also the questions that are being asked by historians of not war periods, historians of peacetime or not war periods need also to engage with us. I think it works both ways, and yeah, I mean, absolutely. The way I put it would well be alienating, but the point that there's this symbiosis that I think both sides, and that we can ourselves make an argument for. I think that's an important one. In terms of the issue of defining ourselves and definitions, on one hand, it would be a lot easier if we didn't have to, because then we wouldn't have to get into this. I mean, historians of causation and context is rather nice. I haven't thought about myself with that. I'm going to spend lunch thinking about which I am. But again, this goes back to we operate within organisational and institutional frameworks. We are defined by our titles. And by the jobs that we go for. And that means that whether one wants to be an Italian historian or a historian of war or a social historian or whatever else, one is still asked to explain and needs to, I think, to be able to explain how one's interests, how one understands one's interests and how they relate to the wider profession. And that's why definition is still important, even though it's frustrating.
I'd just like to point to that. I mean, I just think in our area of operations, we seem to have, I was saying to Jonathan about something earlier on, when you're explaining, you're losing, okay? And I just see that our own kind of like area of study seems to come with an extra level of definition and an extra level of explanation that other disciplines don't have. You know, so I'm constantly fighting, constantly explaining. Yeah.
Let's have some last words for Erica and Selena.
Well, I suppose to try to end on a slightly more optimistic note, I was thinking about this question of bringing together disciplines and also this tension about practitioners and scholars and historians. And I have to say, the Changing Character of War program set up at Oxford under Hugh, I really think is a success story in terms of thinking about how you can integrate practitioners, but also people across disciplines. And I suppose another side to thinking about the pressures that the university and things like the REF put us under is, my sense is actually one of the strongest points of pressure at the moment are large research projects, which is the kind of thing which takes historians out of their comfort zone from working on individual projects. And in this sense, to me, something like the study of war actually has this benefit in which it does draw on larger audiences. It brings in different disciplines, and to me, actually, I see that as being a virtue. So as much as we all agree that on our job applications we might kind of fudge and have to choose how we define ourselves, I think once we actually obtain that magical job, there are ways in which how we conduct our research and being able to be broad and to interact with other people actually, I think, comes to our benefit. And so we're able to take advantage of these pressures that are coming at us from above.
I think Erica said it wonderfully well. I think it's a nice note to end on.
Lunch is downstairs.
I was going to, before we go for lunch, I was going to thank our panel very much for a wonderful session.